This is Deep Night Whispers. Tonight we open a file that was never meant to be found. In 1983, inside a locked records room at the old Colorado State Hospital, a clerk searching through obsolete patient archives discovered an unmarked manila envelope. The paper was brittle, the glue seam still sealed, the ink on its cover faded to the color of bone. Inside were 12 index cards. Each carried a name, a date of birth, and a single notation. Subject observation continues. 6 of the cards were marked in red pencil, 6 were not. No explanation, no report to match them. Only the quiet suggestion that someone, decades earlier, had drawn a line between the living and the soon-to-be lost. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, but the dates told their own story. From 1945 to 1968, 12 children, all born to the same address, catalogued in a hand that betrayed no urgency. On the back of each card were short phrases: compliance partial, observation escalates, intervention deferred, fragments without meaning unless you already knew what to look for. The cards had been filed among unrelated patient records, maybe by mistake, maybe to hide them. For years they sat untouched, the red marks fading, the paper growing thin, until someone opened the envelope again. Not for the first time, but perhaps for the last. What you are about to hear is no work of speculation. It is a reconstruction drawn from medical logs, police reports, family testimony, and the faint handwriting left on 12 pieces of cardstock. 6 of those names lead into hospital wards and locked bedrooms. 6 lead into quieter rooms where fear took the shape of silence. Together they form a story that has been studied by scientists, dissected by psychiatrists, and mourned by those who lived it. And yet, after decades of observation, it remains unresolved. Half a family marked in red, half unmarked, all bound to the same house where the illness did not visit, it lived. The house was new once, pale brick, split level, with a view toward the Air Force Academy in the distance. It stood just outside the limits of Colorado Springs, in a neighborhood where sidewalks gleamed and lawns stayed cut. To the outside world, it looked like everything an American family should be. Inside lived Donald and Mimi Galvin. Parish directories listed them among the devout. A military household, respectable. Donald Sr. had served in the Pacific Campaign and returned home alive but changed. There was no name then for the silence that followed him back from war. Today we would call it post-traumatic stress. He did not drink or shout. He simply withdrew, a little more each year. Mimi had dreamed of New York and culture, but she folded her ambitions inward. Discipline became her religion. Every napkin ironed, every floor polished, every child expected to perform perfection. She believed that structure could carve chaos into virtue. They would have 12 children, 10 boys, and finally, 2 girls. To their church and neighbors, they were a portrait of stability. On Sundays, the boys lined up by height, hair parted, shoes shined, collars starched, their mother immaculate, their father distant but steady. From the sidewalk, nothing looked amiss. Yet even early on, the tension was visible to those who paid attention. By the time they moved into Hidden Valley Road in 1963, people had started to whisper. 12 children was excessive even for a Catholic family, and sometimes there were sounds, thuds, shouts, glass breaking, then sudden quiet. No police were called. The Galvins kept their secrets. Donald Sr. believed in boxing as discipline. The boys sparred instead of being punished. He called them by number, not by name. 4, get in line. 6, clean that up. The house ran on command and response, not affection. Falconry became their shared pastime, training hawks and falcons, mastering control over flight. In photographs, the older boys posed stiffly, birds perched on gloved fists, faces expressionless. To Mimi, it was grace through order. To others, it looked like captivity mistaken for beauty. The girls, Margaret and Mary, who would later call herself Lindsay, entered last, learning to move quietly in a house heavy with masculine unrest. They understood early that silence was safety. Broken windows replaced overnight, bruises hidden under sleeves. Praise was scarce, attention scarcer. Their father was often away. Their mother retreated into cleaning and prayer. By the late 60s, something had begun to stir beneath the routine. The Galvins had no poverty, no addiction, no visible dysfunction, yet neighbors and teachers kept repeating the same unease. Something was wrong in that house. Madness does not always arrive in a storm. Sometimes it seeps, slow, colorless, until the walls themselves start to breathe with it. It began with the firstborn. Donald Jr. was everything his parents hoped for: athletic, disciplined, admired. Coaches praised his focus. Teachers called him a leader. But at family dinners, he would drift, stare into nothing, withdraw behind his own eyes. When asked what was wrong, he said nothing was. In college, the strangeness deepened. One night at a university bonfire, he suddenly leaped into the flames. He emerged laughing, skin blistered, offering no explanation. Months later, his roommate found a dead cat in a box beneath the sink. Donald said it meant nothing, then refused to speak further. No one reported it. He was the general's daughter's boyfriend, the Air Force son, too respectable for madness. At home, he grew more erratic. One winter, he methodically carried every piece of furniture from the living room into the backyard, arranging them in the snow. Another day, he poured salt into the aquarium until the fish died. His parents called it stress. Soon, he spent hours standing in the kitchen, shattering plates one by one, pausing between each like a man listening for an answer. Still, no one intervened. Then, one night, he led his wife into the garage and tried to make her inhale cyanide fumes. She survived. He was arrested. And finally, the word appeared in black ink on hospital paper: paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis brought no relief. It was only a label for the darkness that had already taken hold. By the time Don Jr. was committed to the Colorado State Hospital, 9 younger siblings remained at home. Some had already seen his outbursts, felt his fists, or learned the discipline of silence in his presence. They had no language for what was happening. In the Galvin house, there were no illnesses, only phases, tempers, burdens to be endured. But something had changed. The first crack had opened, and through it, the same quiet contagion would begin to spread, from brother to brother, from room to room. The house on Hidden Valley Road would never heal. Order had been breached, and what waited behind it was not just disease. It was inheritance. It was history. It was the sound of madness breathing in the walls. After Donald Jr. was taken away, the silence he left behind was not peace. It was pressure. Every brother felt it, a tremor that none could name. At first, they tried to imitate normal life. There were still dinners, still church, still photographs in matching sweaters. But the smiles stiffened. The light in their eyes began to dim. The next to change was James. He married young, a girl named Kathy, and for a time he seemed fine, working, providing, playing the role expected of him. But something began to whisper in the corners of his mind. He heard voices when no one was speaking, soft warnings that grew into commands. He began drinking to silence them. The alcohol only made the voices clearer. Soon his paranoia took shape. He accused his wife of betrayal, of conspiring against him, of working for unseen watchers. The violence came in waves, first shouting, then hands. Kathy tried to hide the bruises. She told herself he was under stress, that he'd come back to himself. He never did. The family said little. To Mimi, these were private matters. To outsiders, James was just another Galvin boy trying to find his way. But behind closed doors, his behavior darkened. Later, when his sisters were old enough to speak, they revealed a deeper horror, that James had molested them during those years of unraveling. No police were ever called. The family handled it by not handling it at all. The explanation was simple. He was sick. It was the illness, not him. Then came Brian. Outwardly, he seemed steady, handsome, functional, working in California, even in love with a woman named Noni. For a while, there was hope, but within him, the same distortion was building. 1 month after Noni ended the relationship, neighbors heard gunshots. She was found first, 2 bullets to the chest. Brian lay nearby, 1 to his own head. The police called it a murder-suicide. The family called it tragedy. What they did not say, though everyone knew, was that Brian too had preyed on his sisters when they were children. The pattern repeated, hidden under the word illness, wrapped in the comfort of denial. Each brother's fall seemed to echo the last, as if the house itself were drawing them down one by one. Matthew's break came after a beating from another brother, Joseph. A fight that left Matthew with head trauma and weeks in recovery. When he returned home, he was changed, speaking nonsense, calling himself Paul McCartney, insisting he had written songs he couldn't remember. Once, while visiting a friend, he stripped naked without warning and smashed a ceramic vase against the wall. It wasn't rage, it was disconnection, the slow unraveling of identity until nothing coherent remained. Peter's decline began earlier. At 14, he started wetting himself uncontrollably. He said the devil lived beneath the house. Teachers called him gifted in mathematics and disciplined in hockey, but brilliance could not save him. He began medication after medication, stelazine, thorazine, Haldol. None helped. Eventually, doctors ordered electroconvulsive therapy. The seizures dulled his terror, but also dulled him. He spent his remaining years hovering between exhaustion and fear. Joseph's illness was quieter but crueler. He could still tell what was real and what wasn't, and that awareness was torture. He saw visions, an emperor in the clouds, voices dictating his every move. He lost jobs, lost friends, yet remained gentle, sending birthday cards, apologizing for things he didn't do. He once told his mother that a priest he'd trusted as a child had molested him. She said nothing. The priest was gone, retired, out of reach. Her silence was her answer. By then, 6 of the 10 sons were in different stages of psychosis, each case unique, but all bound by the same thread. The neighbors saw nothing. To them, the Galvins were private, respectable. Inside, the family was living in a storm with no sky, only walls closing in. Madness in that house did not come like lightning. It spread like water through a cracked foundation, filling every room, warping the floors until nothing sat straight. Mimi clung harder to order. Floors waxed, curtains pressed, silver polished. The house was immaculate even when blood stained the carpet. She washed the stains before anyone could see. She told the police everything was fine. The appearance of control was the only control she had left. Lindsay, the youngest, learned to move quietly between the broken men who were once her brothers. She fetched food for the sedated, locked doors before the police arrived, cleaned shards of glass from the floor. Her chores were survival. Police came often but never stayed long. They knew the address. They entered calmly, without sirens, restraining whichever son had lost his hold this time. It became routine. One Thanksgiving, Mimi set the table perfectly. Pressed linens, gleaming silver, the turkey centered just so. For a few minutes it looked like a family again. Then Don Jr. stood, seized the end of the table, and flipped it toward James. Plates shattered. Food splattered across the walls. No one screamed. Within an hour, everything was cleaned. By morning, the dining room looked untouched. The house had become an asylum without paperwork. 6 patients, untrained staff, no charts, no therapy, only containment. The difference between home and hospital was a matter of lighting. Outside, the lawn stayed trimmed, the shutters painted. Inside, the windows were cracked, doors rehung after being kicked in. Neighbors waved. Mimi smiled back. The illusion held because no one wanted to believe that so much madness could fit inside one ordinary home. Among the 12 Galvin children, 4 sons remained untouched by diagnosis: John, Mark, Michael, and Richard. On paper, they were the lucky ones. In reality, they were the witnesses. They lived inside the same walls, breathing the same air, waiting for the same shadow to fall on them. Every night they watched one brother after another unravel, and every morning they wondered if today would be their turn. Survival became a ritual of vigilance. Each twitch, each lapse in focus, each stray thought was examined in secret terror. Was this how it began? John was the first to run. He watched the pattern form. One brother hospitalized, another arrested, another buried, and decided that distance might save him. He moved to Idaho, took a job teaching music, and told himself he had simply chosen peace. But peace never came. He kept the phone nearby at night, half expecting a call telling him he had finally gone mad too. Michael came closest to the edge. As a teenager, he'd been hospitalized twice for what doctors called early disturbance. They gave him stelazine and sent him home. He stopped taking it, refused to be labeled. Instead, he turned inward, teaching himself meditation, isolation, silence. For a time, it worked. He stayed balanced enough to live, to function, though always with the feeling that something just out of sight was watching him, waiting for a weak moment to return. Richard turned to numbers. He built a career in finance, a world of controlled systems and predictable outcomes. In that controlled order, he could breathe. He rarely spoke of his family. His colleagues described him as rigid, detached, uneasy in spontaneous situations. He did not visit home unless duty forced him. Yet the ghost of that house lived behind his every calculation. Tao, Mark, the athlete, the hockey player, seemed the most whole. He had trained beside brothers who later vanished into delusion. He played the same ice, shared the same blood. When their minds broke, he looked in the mirror for cracks in his own reflection. He never found any, but he never stopped searching. In later years, he said it felt like holding a door shut without knowing what waited behind it. They were called unaffected by researchers. An easy word that means nothing. They escaped the diagnosis, but not the inheritance. The illness shaped their lives anyway, in guilt, in fear, in the long quiet nights where every passing shadow could be a symptom waiting to wake. Mimi kept the household moving with military precision. She scrubbed bloodstains from carpets, repaired doors, replaced dishes, and smiled for the parish bulletin photographs. She believed order could defeat chaos if only she tried hard enough. Her devotion to perfection was not vanity. It was a survival. If the world saw her family as normal, then maybe it would become so. Every detail of her life was a defense against collapse. Curtains pressed flat. Meals served at the exact same hour. Children in clean clothes, no matter what had happened the night before. Her identity as a mother was welded to control. To admit defeat was to admit that everything she had built was already dead. The neighbors admired her composure. They called her strong, resilient, a saint for raising so many. No one saw the blood on her hands from scrubbing walls at 3 in the morning, or the tremor in her breath as she listened for the next shattering sound. The daughters, Margaret and Lindsay, grew up inside this illusion. They learned that safety was not in screaming, but in silence. When violence erupted, they locked themselves in the master bedroom, crouched in corners, and waited until the noise stopped. They were told their brothers were just sick, that the sickness was part of life, that family meant endurance. Endurance became their only inheritance. Margaret was the one her mother had wanted most, a daughter to dress, to shape, to polish. She was taught order the way other children are taught love. Every mistake corrected, every emotion measured, but the order did not protect her. In time, Margaret would tell what no one wanted to hear, that Brian, and later James, had molested her when she was still a child. Lindsay confirmed it. The same brothers who raged and broke dishes also broke silence in darker ways. When the truth finally reached Mimi, her reaction was not disbelief. It was distance. She said the boys were sick. She called it part of their illness, as though naming it could reduce it to something clinical, something she could fold away with the laundry. Margaret did not run. She stayed close, helped her mother, tended to the broken, and learned to disappear within the routine. Lindsay, the youngest, could not. She saw the house for what it was, a cage built of silence. At 14, she took a scholarship to a boarding school, left Colorado Springs, and did not look back. She carried with her the guilt of escape and the weight of survival. Years later, in therapy, she would describe her childhood as a long hallway of closed doors. Behind each one was a brother, a memory, a sound she could not forget. When the sisters finally confronted Mimi as adults, demanding acknowledgement, she told them something unexpected. She too had been molested as a child by her stepfather. She said it calmly, as if it explained everything. She had endured, and she believed her daughters could too. Survival, not healing, was the family tradition. Donald Sr. never intervened. He drifted through the house like a ghost, speaking little, seeing less. His silence became the final authority. The Galvin home was not simply broken. It was organized around its own fracture. Madness and trauma did not interrupt the order. They were the order. Everything revolved around keeping it hidden. By the end of the 1970s, the house had transformed completely. It was no longer a family home, but an unlicensed psychiatric ward. Doors locked from the outside, rooms cleared of breakables, medication bottles on every shelf. Mimi distributed pills, adjusted dosages without doctor's consent, sometimes to calm a son before visitors arrived, sometimes to keep one awake long enough to say grace at dinner. Furniture was replaced so often that the living room looked like a showroom for accidents. Glass shards buried in carpet, blood wiped from walls before neighbors could notice. When something broke, it was repaired by morning. The illusion never slipped for long. The police stopped using sirens when they came. They knew the address by heart. They entered quietly, restrained the raging son, and left with paperwork marked domestic disturbance. Lindsay watched everything. She was no longer a daughter, but an orderly, helping her mother clean after outbursts, bandaging cuts, feeding sedated brothers. Childhood had no room in that house, only maintenance. One by one, the brothers vanished into hospitals. Some came home, medicated, hollow-eyed. Some didn't. Thanksgiving after Thanksgiving, the table grew smaller. By the early 1980s, what remained of the Galvin family was a handful of survivors orbiting the ruins of a household. The Colorado State Hospital now held their history in its drawers: charts, medication logs, police notes, the faint signatures of doctors who no longer practiced. The rest of the world moved on. Inside the family, time only repeated. When genetic researchers began collecting blood samples from families with unusually high rates of schizophrenia, the Galvins were invited. They agreed. Vials were filled, labeled not with names but with codes, sealed and frozen. At the time, the technology could not read what the blood contained. It was simply stored, cold proof of something that no one yet understood. Decades later, the samples were thawed again. New sequencing tools traced millions of markers until one anomaly stood out, a mutation in a single gene, SHANK2. The protein it produced shaped the scaffolding of the synapse, the microscopic bridge where one neuron speaks to another. Disruption there can twist perception itself, make the brain mishear its own signals. The mutation appeared in every sibling tested, both those who were ill and those who were not. It was not a cause, only a possibility, a fuse that might burn or might never light. Environment, trauma, chance. The trigger could be anything or nothing at all. The finding was a revelation for science and a dead end for the family. There was no cure, no prevention, no certainty. Only knowledge that the map of their suffering had always been written inside them. By then, the parents were old. Donald Sr. had faded into silence and died in 2003. Mimi lived another 14 years, keeping her secrets intact. She left no confession, no reevaluation, only neat drawers and labeled boxes. When she was buried beside her husband, the headstones gave no hint of what had lived beneath their roof. James had died before her in 2001, his heart failing under decades of antipsychotic medication. Peter, the boy who once spoke of devils beneath the house, died quietly in his sleep in 2023. Don Jr. and Matthew remain institutionalized, men long past the point of rehabilitation, their conditions managed rather than treated. Their files still update periodically, though the handwriting has changed. Lindsay, the youngest, returned near the end. She sorted through papers, arranged benefits, signed burial forms, tried to close what could not be closed. She became the family's final custodian, the one who would decide what to keep and what to let disappear. Writers came, then doctors, then filmmakers. The story was told and retold, first as a book, Hidden Valley Road, inside the mind of an American family, then as a documentary, then as a case study at medical conferences. Each version promised understanding, and each fell short. No publication could capture the sound of a lock sliding on a child's bedroom door, or the long hush that followed glass breaking in the dark. The house itself still stands on Hidden Valley Road. New owners repainted the walls, replaced the floors, changed the windows. But some houses remember. They remember the weight of footsteps at midnight, the smell of disinfectant, the air that never entirely clears. 12 names once lived there, 6 marked in red, 6 spared, but never free. Genetics can measure sequence, but not silence. No test explains why madness chose that address or why it spared others. The mutation offers a path without destination, a blueprint for disorder without a reason. The Galvin family became data, citations, and files, yet the core of their story remains untouched. A single house where the boundary between order and insanity dissolved, and a mother who kept scrubbing the floors while the world collapsed around her. If you have stayed with me through this history, know this: some stories end in resolution, others only in record. Hidden Valley Road is both. It is an archive of voices that could not stop speaking and of those who were never heard. The files are closed now, the drawers locked again, but the whisper remains. This was Deep Night Whispers, and sometimes the night does not tell us why. It only reminds us what it remembers.